Welcome to a new unit. This is our second to last unit, our last kind of real one, because Unit 9 is going to be very tiny. The title for this is A Competition of Ideologies and Cultures, and really, Unit 8 is a lot. We're going to look at the Cold War. We're going to look at the foreign policy things that are involved in that, and a space race, and an arms race, and that competition. But also, we have some dramatic upheaval in American society between different cultures, different beliefs, quality, those sort of things. And then there's times where those two things merge together and play off of each other. And so there is going to be a lot. But this is arguably one of the most significant units for where we are kind of modern day. So it is truly important. Our question for today: how did post-war American culture reflect the ongoing Cold War? And again, keep the Cold War in the back of your mind because that's dominating stuff, throughout this whole unit. Eisenhower is going to win the presidential election in 1952. And so I'm going to kind of do the 50s while we're in here as well. And Eisenhower was militarily famous. He was very significant during World War II, and he's a Republican. And he's going to push something called modern Republicanism. And I've mentioned this in a previous lesson, but I'll reiterate it again. Yes, Republican, Democrat, the names are important, what they stand for is important, but also keep in mind the adage of what about progressive versus conservative? And I use those with lowercase letters. Progressive would be looking to push things and change stuff moving forward. Conservative looking to stay the way things are. Keep those two movements in the back of your mind, not just the idea of capital R Republican, capital D Democrat. In looking at Eisenhower's modern Republicanism, let's keep some of these things in mind and think about, all right, do they apply to modern day Republicans or not? One, determined to slow the growth of the federal government. That is absolutely something you are going to see with modern Republicans and conservatism. Limit powers of the president and expand powers of Congress and the courts. This is going all the way back to the Jeffersonian ideas of limiting the power of the presidency, but it does include the expanding powers of Congress and the courts. So we're still seeing the federal government get that power. It's just going away from the president. Remember, keep this in mind that this is after people like FDR, who have been president and who were oftenly chided for being dictator-like. But there isn't interest in reversing the New Deal. It's just, let's not move this stuff more progressive into the future. The New Deal is aggressively popular. And so there isn't a movement to try and repeal those things. It's just, all right, now that we're here, let's not move too much more forward. This quote here, conservative when it comes to money, liberal when it comes to human beings, is going to be something to watch throughout the rest of American history. If you stopped random people on the street, generally the socially acceptable line would be, I'm conservative around fiscal policy and I'm liberal around social issues. That's generally what the American public is willing to identify as themselves. Whether or not that's true for each individual person, that's a different story. But there is a belief in society that that is socially acceptable. To be more conservative when it comes to fiscal policy, but to be more progressive or liberal when it comes to, social equality and things like that. And so you will see an extension of Social Security to include an additional 10 million people. So yes, keeping that Social Security of the New Deal, but expanding it to keep in mind that human beings part. Raise of the minimum wage from 75 cents an hour to $1. Oh, those times. The cabinet is going to be composed of businessmen who will encourage and support corporate USA. Remember, we're seeing a Cold War developing where capitalism is like an American thing. Start to watch these corporations become more involved, especially more in the Republican aspect of these presidencies, because we're going to see that really come to fruition with Reagan more at the end of this unit into the next unit. So in looking at that, it's kind of a balancing act, right? And it does. There are ways that this is more conservative. Let's go back to maybe the Gilded Age idea of bringing those corporations back into power and being a part of the political ideology and the ideas moving forward. But, well, let's acknowledge the New Deal happened and that progressive stuff was helpful and people liked it. So let's extend maybe some of that Social Security and stuff like that. As I mentioned during the last video, we are going to see the kind of bringing down of uniformed soldiers as they move into society. There are things like the GI Bill that are going to be significant in helping them have like a smooth transition into regular life. And there is going to be the baby boom, and we need to keep an eye on these children because they are going to be, well, I mean, they're the boomers, right? Like that's what we talk about now. We're like, oh, boomers. This is where they're coming about. So they're being born in this time, and we're going to really see them grow into teenage-ish years during the 60s, especially the late 60s, and then onward. So this is where the boomers are going to come up. One of the things that we'll start to see in the 50s is going to be, well, I'll get to this in a second here, the idea of like the 50s housewife or the 50s domestic ideals, and we'll watch some crazy videos. But one of the things we're going to start to see is the suburbanization of America. And really, this is going to take off with Levitt towns. And there's also going to then usher in white flight. So Levitt are these basically suburbs. You pick from these very few limited styles of houses, and they will build it for you in these suburbs. So not in the cities anymore. Look at that aerial view. I mean, jump on Google Maps or Apple Maps or whatever, switch to the satellite view, take a peek around Fuquay and Cary and Apex and Holly Springs. You see a lot of developments like that. We're suburbs. With the availability of the car, you can have people living in the suburbs and commuting back into the cities if needed for work, but not living in the cities themselves. And what we're going to see is white flight. Overwhelmingly, you're going to see white people leave the cities and move out to these suburbs. And they do this because, you know, bigger houses and things like that. But there is also a racial component to this. You can see the sign here, we want white tenants in our white community. There are a lot of examples of people of color trying to move into these suburbs and being prevented from doing that, whether through kind of intimidation like this or through redlining laws that and policies that banks are going to have, preventing loans from being given out to people of color. Or maybe it's the developments themselves not selling houses to people of color. In fact, there was one significant example of trying to break this color barrier in a Levittown, and it was when a white family purchased the house and then rented it out to a person of color specifically to get around that. And like the neighbors were like literally like standing on their lawn, like yelling stuff at them, like aggressively racist. And if we look at this cartoon here, this is an example of a modern political cartoon. So you see whites live in the cities, and the city is saying, this is the crowning glory of civilization. Look at our cities. And then minorities start moving into the cities. And then they're like, hello. And then white people are like, goodbye. So then whites flee cities and go to these suburbs. And you see that first ring of suburbs. This is better. Then you see an additional ring of suburbs. White moves into second ring suburbs. And the quote says, cities are dead. This is better still. Then you have minorities start to move into the first ring of suburbs. And then you go, this is better, I guess. And then whites move back into the cities and they say, it worked. This is what we would commonly call now gentrification, when you're seeing white people then come back into the cities. And as these white people come back into these neighborhoods, the price to live in these neighborhoods goes up. The price for businesses in the area go up. And then you see gentrification. One of the big things in the 50s is going to be family dynamics. And we're going to watch a video during live that is just, I mean, you look at that and you're like, wow, that's the 50s. And so when we're looking at this, it's important to keep in mind when we're talking about, so this says the nuclear family in the Cold War. And this is kind of a play on words here, right? There's the nuclear family, as in the mother, the father, and their children. But then there's also the nuclear family, like this is a family living during the Cold War where they're afraid about nuclear weapons. And so in looking at the nuclear weapons part, this is a wedding gift. And it says, these are mostly donated by the builder, including stocks of food and items of special equipment to be used later in the shelter, because people are worried about bombs going off. But the 50s are significant socially, especially when you're going to contrast them to the 60s. The 50s is like kind of that classic thing that you would expect of like, women are supposed to be in the kitchen. They're supposed to do the domestic duties. The man will go work outside the home, bring the money back. The children will go to school. The boys should be go-getters. the women or the girls should be meek and they should listen to what's happening. They should help take care of the house because they're going to have babies. That's the cycle. And that's the 50s. And we'll look again at some of these examples of these videos showing you that you should do this. But contrast that with the 60s, where you're going to start to see a big push of, hey, maybe we don't have to fit into these little boxes. But we'll cover that later on in the unit. There is the second Red Scare, and I've alluded to this before with domestic policy under Truman. We've, of course, seen the first Red Scare, but in looking at the second Red Scare, this is kind of like kicking stuff up a notch. So the second Red Scare pre-McCarthy, because you're going to have McCarthyism, and then you're going to have, of course, pre-McCarthy. So pre-McCarthy, we did see those loyalty review systems that Truman implemented. We saw this in the Loeffler documents that we read. This is where government employees will have to demonstrate their patriotism without knowing potential accusations against them. Generally, the Red Scare, I would liken it to the paranoia you might see in the Salem witch trials, in which this case you're seeing people who they're accused of being red, and that could be for any sort of random associations with people, or you went to this club in college or whatever. There's immigration quotas that are put back in 1952. And then there's HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee. They're established. And in 47, you'll see the Hollywood 10. There is a focus on Hollywood because in general, Hollywood tends to be more liberal. And so you had a lot more people connected to these more communist stuff, whether through college or just things they were interested in. And you had people legitimately who were like, oh, I think America should be more communistic. I don't think we should stick with this. And again, we're America. We should be okay with people having discussions about this. But the concern is, no, these are in Hollywood. They're going to be showing things to America and they can use propaganda, and that's a problem. In fact, you're going to see Westerns become really big around this time period because there's a push to like limit political speech in these movies. And so all Western. Can't get mad at Western. McCarthy is going to really kick this up a notch. Joseph McCarthy, and this will start about February 1950, he will announce that he has a list of 205 communists working for the State Department. Now, he ultimately does not ever reveal this list, but he basically is like, I have this list, and these people are all essentially double agents. They've infiltrated America. In the very conspiratorial time in which we live, it is totally reasonable to go, yeah, I could see a senator coming forward and being like, I have this list of double agents who have infiltrated the government, and then not ever revealing the list, but millions of people being like, you're right, we're being taken over. And he's going to lead hearings to try and go after people. Now, during Truman's time, you are going to see Republicans supporting McCarthy. And then when Eisenhower comes to power, you're going to see less of that. McCarthy is definitely going to be more of an extremist than you're going to have the Republican base around Eisenhower. And this lack of support from Eisenhower is going to lead to questions about, are you being soft on communism? And just keep an eye out for that. The idea of being soft on communism is going to pop up again and again in this unit as ways for generally more conservative people to attack generally more liberal people. It's not always that, but it's an easy attack that you can lob against people. And we'll see things like calling people pink, right? They're not red, but they're pink, a little soft on communism. You'll see that come up as well. So keep an eye out for that. Ultimately, McCarthy's downfall are going to be the Army McCarthy hearings in 54. These are televised, and essentially there's finally this one point where you'll have an attorney for one of the people accused who has a memorable line where he says to McCarthy, "Do you have no sense of decency, sir?"
Let us not assassinate this lad further, Senator. You've done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?
And basically, he has what we would call a viral moment, right? Where he's like, this is ridiculous. You need to stop. And you're going to see public support decline for McCarthy. And ultimately, that is going to go away. This idea of we should publicly be chasing down people and accusing them of these aggressive crimes for really stuff they haven't done. J. Edgar Hoover, shout out to an absolutely terrible Leonardo DiCaprio film that you could watch. I did not think it was very entertaining or well made, but that's a side point. There's going to be expansion of the FBI, and it is going to be based around this worry about needing to find communists. And we're not done seeing the FBI. They are going to do aggressively terrible stuff during the civil rights movement, so we'll come back to that. But you are going to start to see an expansion of that out of this need or this fear of, oh no, we're being infiltrated by communism. And to be fair, there are communists who are sent over to become spies, and there are absolutely people from the Soviet Union who infiltrate places of power. The FBI, in fact, is going to have a very significant spy in its midst eventually. So that's not fundamentally wrong, but it is kicked way out of proportion. Couple cartoons here. This first one, you can see at the top, say, whatever happened to freedom from fear, right? That was the thing that was pushed before. Like, we don't need to be afraid. We can have freedom from that. And this is talking, you can see all of this different kind of chase down of these people. Start with, if you ain't for Franco and Cheng, you're un-American. And then you're seeing this smear job coming from McCarthy, going against State Department, civil rights, all sorts of things. And this is the what happened to freedom from fear. So yeah, we're afraid. The other one I think is really good for showing HUAC, and it has the Committee on Un-American Activities driving through these passerbyers, and this person turning around yelling, "It's okay, we're hunting communists." And I think back to that Melvin Loeffler quote that we read that mentions even contemporaries were acknowledging that maybe in this desire to go prevent communism, or in this case, root out communism, we're actually going too far. You've had these two people run over by the car. They're driving into a group of people. Maybe we're going too far in this hunt for communists. I will introduce the race to the top and the space race in this. So we are going to see the creation of NASA. This is all based around the Soviets launching the first satellite, Sputnik, and it terrifying Americans. We are shaken to our core. How could the Soviets beat us in something? And you're going to start to see from here on out, because we got complacent with the bomb, right? Like, we had the bomb, and we're like, it's fine. And then we see them advance, we're like, whoa, that's a problem. We pour money into things like NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration. We want an independent agency for space exploration. That'll lead to Explorer 1, the Mercury project, the eventual Apollo program, stuff like that. But one of the big things, and this is actually something that I was taught in college in my education classes, we notice that the Soviets are ahead of us, and we go, you know what? We need to boost spending on education. So there will be the National Defense Education Act. More federal money is going to be spent on science and math education. And this is so that we can be able to meet and beat the Soviet Union. This is going to provide low-cost loans for people to go to college if they become teachers, because education is important. And it is also going to give money to state colleges and universities to build science and foreign language facilities. If we want to go be players on the world stage and we want to combat communism, it's helpful to speak other languages so we can kind of get to those people in other places. And this is something that's kind of significant to America, and it's one of the main driving factors of us. When we determine something to be against our best interest, our defense usually in that case, we're willing to spend any amount of money and push any policy to kind of prevent that from being a vulnerability. There's also going to be the arms race in this race to the top, and this is going to involve money spent obviously on, weapons in the military. You are going to see a focus from Eisenhower on more of a, let's not use conventional troops, let's use atomic weapons if needed, but let's go all out. We want to keep atomic weapons on the table. So you're going to see policies of things like massive retaliation. We are willing to, no matter what you do, we'll use atomic weapons. It's fine. You're going to see things like brinkmanship take us right up to the edge of the war and not like a eventual real war with the Soviet Union, and don't back down. Those things are changes from what we kind of have seen in the past and what we're going to see in the future. But it's Eisenhower going, I don't want to lose soldiers' lives to this when I have massive weapons that I have. You're going to see the national highway system that is created. I don't know if you've ever driven on a highway and seen the little Eisenhower logo as you go, but that is built, this huge infrastructure package, specifically to help America with defense. You have every so often, you have to have a mile stretch. The bridge have to be high enough so that you could drive a truck carrying, atomic weapons underneath it. You have to have that long stretch so you could land a plane if necessary. Again, America's willing to do this because we're threatened defensively. Keep that in mind as we look at some very substantial problems facing us like climate change and decide, well, when will America choose to take action? And my argument is going to be when we feel that our defense is being attacked. But Eisenhower also is going to warn of something called the military-industrial complex. And we're going to see this pop up a lot more in more modern times, especially around the turn of the 2000s. So this is a quote here: "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children." And essentially, if we're spending money on defense, then we're not spending that money on other things. And yeah, that's a valid point. And we're going to start to see him calling attention to this. And one of the reasons why you want to kind of bring down maybe conventional forces. But we'll start to see this make more appeals again in the early 2000s. This concern that, hey, maybe defense contractors are really working closely with the government to make us more willing to spend money on defense and more willing to fight wars because it's better for their financial bottom line. When we talk Eisenhower and his doctrine, it's going to be more of a focus now in the Middle East. And so you will see the Suez Canal crisis. The Middle East is trying to grapple with disagreements between oil-rich Arab nations and this newly formed state of Israel. That has not been solved, obviously, even now. But Israel becomes its own country now, and you are going to see an instant war between them and generally the Arab nations. And America is going to step in on behalf of Israel, but there is going to be tension in the Middle East. And there is going to be an attempt to seize and nationalize the British and French-owned ports or parts of the Suez Canal. That is an attack against us because any control in the Suez Canal, which we're seeing Russia try and dabble with now, is something that threatens our access to oil and also the world. So we want to prevent that. There's going to be a response by Britain and France, and Eisenhower is upset that we're not told about it. And this segues into the Eisenhower doctrine. We pledge support for Middle Eastern countries that are threatened by communism. Under the Truman Doctrine, way more Eastern European focus. Now, we're willing to include the Middle East. OPEC is going to be formed in 1960. This is the oil and petroleum exporting countries, and oil will become a foreign policy issue. That clearly is not going to go away, and that's going to be another reason why the Middle East will play such an important factor in American foreign policy from this point onward. There's also the U-2 incident. Nikita Khrushchev is the new Soviet leader. We are basically sending planes over and we're spying on them, let's be honest. And 2 weeks before there is a planned meeting between Eisenhower and Khrushchev in Paris, a U.S. spy plane is shot down in Russian airspace by the Soviets, obviously. And America comes out and says, oh, that thing you shot down? Yep, it was a weather plane. We weren't spying, so no. And then the Soviets reveal, oh, no, we captured the plane. We have it. Oh, and we also captured the pilot alive. And so America has to come out and do an about face and in the world, publicly be like, yeah, we were spying on you and we got caught and we lied about it. So you aren't going to be able to see a thaw in tensions in the Cold War because we just got a plane that we were spying on them with shot down and it's kind of a problem. So if we're looking at that Cold War, this is something to kind of just snapshot and keep an eye on these things as they progress moving forward. The Soviets launched Sputnik in 1957. That shocks us, scares us to our core. There is communist control of Vietnam. We are going to cover Vietnam in a lot more detail later on this unit, but you're going to start to see problems forming in Vietnam. There is the U-2 incident. We're not able to thaw tensions with the Soviets because we're spying on them. There is growing and increasing fear of nuclear attacks. Shout out to the family, getting those supplies in order. And Fidel Castro is going to take over in Cuba in 1959. All of these things are leading up to a very, very close presidential race in 1960 between Richard Nixon, who kind of gets his start by following a lot of these McCarthy type things and chasing down communism, and John F. Kennedy.